We continue now at the top of Daf65b Daf Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 65b. The Gemara says, "V'hilchasok Rav Chama." The halach is like Rav Chama. That refers to the tacit interest on the previous summer that Rav Chama spoke about. That is going to be permitted. V'hilchasok Rav Elazar. The halach is like Rav Elazar. Rashi says, "V'hilchasok Rav Elazar the ribis kitzutza yotza b'dayanin." That if you have fixed ribis, so then the judges take it away and they give it back to the borrower. And finally, the Gemara says, "V'hilchasok Rav Yanai." The halach is like Rav Yanai. The Amar Mali Heinu Mali Demein, who says there's no difference between giving the produce. Let's say a certain amount of produce is owed, so then not only can you give the produce, you can give the value of that produce as well. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Machar lo es asad, if he sells him a field, v'nasan lo mixas damim, and the buyer gives to the seller some of the money. V'yamar lo, and he says to him, Eimosai shatirtza have mos, v'tol as shalcha, when you want to bring money and then take what is yours, asr, that is going to be forbidden. And Rashi explains, asr, it's forbidden, lasos kain, it's forbidden to do that. V'davka do amar le l'chimaisis moser hamos kana me'achshav. The case here in the Mishnah specifically is when he says that when you bring the rest of the money, you're going to acquire the field retroactively. So he essentially puts a down payment, and then the seller says, when you bring the rest of the money retroactively, you'll acquire this field. Lefikach asr lasos kain. It's for that reason it's asr to do this. Why? Shim yochal mocher peiros besochach. Let's say, for example, the seller is the one getting the produce in the meantime. The question over here is going to be who exactly is consuming the produce from this field in the interim period. So let's say you say it's the seller that's consuming the produce in the interim period. So then what happens is when this person eventually brings the rest of the money, it turns out that the buyer was the owner of the field from the time of the sale. So why was the seller having the produce if the buyer retroactively turns out to be the owner of the field? The reason the buyer was getting the produce was bischar hamtanas ma'osa, was because he essentially extended a loan to this buyer. He said to the buyer, you don't have to pay me right away, even though you're acquiring retroactively from today, from this date, but you're going to pay me the rest of the money later. And so therefore, in exchange for the fact that he lent him money, he is getting the produce. That's a problem of interest. Now that would be in a situation where the seller is the one consuming the produce. Let's say it's the other way around. Vim yochal lokeach peiros. Now let's say the buyer is the one that gets the produce me'achsha from this point in time, meaning he's getting the produce in the interim. Shema lo yavi moser hamos. So the problem is like this: maybe he won't bring the rest of the money, and he won't actually acquire the field. V'yachzer lo zeh mashakibul, and then the seller will return that partial payment that was made, that down payment. He'll return it to the buyer because the buyer never follows through on the sale. V'nimtza shelo haisa sada knuyalo. Turns out that the buyer never actually bought the field. T'halachi maisis kani me'achshav amarle, because he said you'll acquire the field retroactively when you bring the rest of the money. And he never brings the rest of the money. And if that is the case, so what really happened over here was umos harishonos kamilva be'alma. That original money, that down payment that the lokeach gave, actually just turns out to be a loan to the seller. That's actually what happened. He lent him money, and then the money was given right back. Eitzel mocher, he lent money to the seller. V'zeh achal peiros b'scharo, and the buyer got to get produce. That was essentially payment for the loan, so it's a problem in that direction. So in both directions, you can have a problem depending on what unfolds. In this situation where the lokeach gives part of the money to acquire retroactively, so there's going to be considered a loan in this situation in one direction or the other, and therefore you can potentially have a problem. If either party eats the peiros, you'll have a problem of ribis. And the Mishnah continues, Hilveyu al sadeyu, if the malva lends the money to the lova, and he takes the lova's field as collateral, v'yamar lo, and he says to the lova, imi atanosin li mikan v'at shalosh shanim, if you don't pay me back the loan within 3 years, harei shali, so then I'm going to keep the field. Essentially, the money I gave you is going to be a purchase of the field. Harei shalo, that does work. He gets to keep the field in such a situation. V'kach haya baitus ben zonin osa, al pi chachamim, and that's what baitus ben zonin did, according to the ruling of the chachamim. And the Gemara says, Mi ochel peiros, who's the one that consumes the produce? This is referring to the first case of the Mishnah. Again, in the first case of the Mishnah, the buyer puts down a down payment, and the seller says that when you bring the rest of the money, then you'll get the field. So the question is, in the interim, who's the one that's consuming the produce from this field? Rav Huna says, Mocher ochel peiros, it's the seller that's consuming the produce. Rav Hanan says, Meshalshen es ha-peiros, they give the produce to a third party. Neither party gets the produce. And the Gemara explains velo pligi. There's not really a machlokus over here. Hadi amar lechimaisis kani. In one case, we're talking about where he says, when you bring the rest of the money, then you will acquire the field. Meaning in a situation where the seller tells the buyer, at the point in time that you bring the rest of the money, only at that point in time, you're going to acquire the field. It's not going to be retroactive. So then essentially the field really still belongs to the seller, and the seller gets the peiros. That's what Rav Huna was talking about. But in the case of Rav Anan, where Rav Anan said that you have to give the peiros to a third party, that's in a situation where it's going to be retroactive. When the buyer brings the rest of the money, he retroactively gets the field, and that's like Rashi explained on the Mishnah. There you have a potential problem in both directions. Whether it's the seller or the buyer that takes the produce, it could end up coming to a situation of ribis, of interest, again, as Rashi explained on the Mishnah, and that's why Rav Anan says the produce has to be given to a third party. And Rashi explains, miochel peiros machar v'kibel mixas miochel peiros besochkach. Again, he sells the property, he gets some of the payment, he gets a down payment, who gets the produce in the interim. Mocher ochel peiros lekamei muki lo shaper kidemefarish v'lo pligi. The Gemara is going to explain this as it goes on, that really the two opinions are not actually arguing. The first opinion is the seller gets the produce, mishalshin. The second explanation is it goes to a third party, mafkideno so biad shlish, meaning to say we give the peiros to a third party, im yigmor mekcho yitzanim lelokech. Now, if the sale actually goes through, then the lokech will get that produce, v'im lo v'yachzer hamocher mashekibo v'yitel perosav, and if not, so then the seller returns whatever money in the down payment he got, and he'll be able to take the produce. As the Gemara explained, hadu amar le'lechimaisis kani. In one case, we're talking where he says, when you bring the money at that point in time, you'll get the field. So then the mocher ochel peiros, then the seller can consume the produce, shein hasad dekanu lo ela mikanu laba, because the buyer is only going to get it from the point in time he gives all the money. V'yad hashta didei achal, so it's no problem if the seller takes the produce. That's his until now. And hadi amar lechim ma'ases kani me'achshav. However, if it's a case where the buyer gets it retroactively when he brings all the money, so ein zeh ela tanai shem yekayim tano yasad kani lo min hayom. That's essentially a condition that if he fulfills the condition, then he gets the field from today retroactively, meaning v'im kayim tano nimsa shachal hamocher peiros shalokeach. And let's say, for example, he fulfills the tanai, so then retroactively it really belonged to the buyer, and the seller got the produce shel lokeach, of the lokeach, ad achshav b'schar hamtanos mosav. He essentially got that produce because of the fact that he extended a loan that he didn't make the lokeach pay right away, and so that would be problematic in that situation. And as Rashi said, it could be the reverse problem as well. If you had the lokeach consuming the peiros and he did not complete the tanai, he didn't complete the condition, that could also be a problem. And so that's why we give it to a third party. And the Gemara continues, Tani Rav Safra b'ribis devei Rav Yechia. Rav Safra taught regarding ribis that was taught in the yeshiva of Rav Yechia. Pa'amim sheshneim mutarim, sometimes both of them it's mutter. Pa'amim sheshneim asurin, sometimes both of them it's asur. Upa'amim shahamocher mutter v'lokeach asur, sometimes it's mutter for the mocher, but it's asur for the lokeach, for the buyer. Upa'amim shalokeach mutter mocher asur, sometimes it's mutter for the buyer, and it's asur for the mocher. And the question is exactly what this means. Rashi explains, Tani Rav Safra v'lo hayem meforish b'mishnah masai shneim mutarin u'masai asurin. We don't know exactly what it means when they're both mutar, when they're both asur, etc. Uperish Rava misvara. So Rava is now going to explain it based on logic, and that's what the Gemara continues. Ani Rava Basrei. So Rava answered after and explained as follows: Pa'amim sheshneim mutar, and sometimes it's mutar for both of them. It means as follows: Diyamar le kni kashir zuzach. Let's say he says to him, let's say the case is again the lokech puts a down payment down, so he says acquire according to the amount of money that you've put down so far. Rashi explains, Kenime hashta kashir zuzach, you can acquire from now according to the amount of money you have put down right now. V'hashar l'chimaisas kani, and then the rest of the field you'll get when you bring the rest of the money. So then we'll say ze ochel peiros karka hamagil adamim shenasan. So then the buyer can have the produce according to the amount of land that he's gotten so far. V'hamocher ochel hashar, and then the seller can get the rest. That's what it means to say that they're both mutter to get the produce. That's how Rava understands pa'amim sheshneim mutarim. And then you have a case of pa'amim sheshneim asurim. Sometimes both of them, neither party can have the produce. Diyamar le, that would be, again, this would be like the case Rashi had, where it can go in both directions, problematic. Diyamar le l'chimaisis kani me'achshav. If the seller says to the buyer, when you bring the rest of the money, you're going to acquire it retroactively. So now we don't know what's really going to happen. If the buyer brings the money, then he's really the owner retroactively. retroactively of the field. If he doesn't bring the money, then it's really the seller that's the owner, so neither party is able to take the produce in that situation. As Rashi says, L'chi maisis kani hakol me'achshav, when you bring the rest of the money, you'll get everything from now retroactively, so then Shnei Masur, and then it's both of them can't take the produce, Kidefarishis La'el, as I explained earlier, meaning as Rashi explained on the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Pa'amim mocher mutter v'lokeach chaser, sometimes the mocher is the one that's allowed to have the peiros, but the buyer is not allowed to have the peiros. Diamar le, that's when the seller says to the buyer, L'chi maisis kani, that when you actually bring the money, at that point in time, you'll acquire the field. So in that case, obviously, up until that point in time, it all belongs to the mocher, and the mocher can have the peiros. And finally, pa'amim shalokeach mutter mocher aser, sometimes it's the lokeach that's allowed to have the peiros, and the mocher cannot. Diamar le, that would be a case where the seller says to the buyer, Kni me'achshav, you acquire from right now. It's not retroactive. By putting down the money, the down payment, you acquire the field completely. And now the rest of the money you owe is essentially a loan. It's a debt that you owe to me. So in that situation, he completely owns the property, the buyer, and therefore the buyer is the one that's able to take the produce. And Rashi explains, L'chi maisis kani, when you bring the rest of the money, at that point in time, you're going to get the field. So in that case, ad maisi sada shel mocher, until the money's brought, it actually belongs to the mocher. So the mocher gets the peiros. And kani me'achshav v'zuzi lahavi halva gabach, if he says you acquire now, and the rest of the money you owe as a loan, kevan da'akne me'achshav, since he owns it from now, harei shel lokech, it belongs to the buyer. V'im yochal mocher peiros, now if the mocher in this case would consume the produce, b'schar hamtanos mos yochlem. So essentially he's getting it because of the fact that he lent him money. That would be problematic, and of course in this case it's the lokeach that's allowed to consume the produce. And the Gemara continues, Man Tana Shneim Asur, and who is this Tana that says they're both Asur? In the case where the Lokech brings the rest of the money and then acquires the field retroactively, where we said there could be a scenario in both directions where it turns into Ribis. So who's the Tana that says that? Amar Rav Huna B'Reider Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna the son of Rav Yoshua says, the Loke Rav Yehuda cannot be following Rav Yehuda, to eat Rav Yehuda, because if it followed Rav Yehuda, Ha'amar Tzad Echad B'Ribis Mutter. Rav Yehuda says that if there's a Tzad Echad B'Ribis, meaning if a certain scenario unfolds that it turns into ribis, so there Rabbi Yehuda said that's actually mutter, and that's actually the situation in this kind of a retroactive sale. If you have a situation where when he brings in the rest of the money, retroactively he acquires the field, so it really depends what happens in terms of whether it is ribis or not. Rabbi Yehuda would say that is not considered ribis, and Rashi explains, tzad echad, again, there's only one scenario where it could come to ribis, dil ma'asi lidei ribis, dil ma'loasi. In other words, you have a case where it might come to ribis, it might not. Ketzad, how so? In mocher ochlem, let's say for example, the mocher is the one consuming the produce, v'lo gamar lokeach mecho, but then the lokeach, the buyer, doesn't finish up the purchase, he doesn't bring the rest of the money, and essentially then the mocher returns the down payment, and the mocher is the owner of the property, so ein kan ribis, so then there's no ribis, because the mocher was consuming the produce, and it actually turned out to be his property. But let's say the lokeach actually does finish the sale, and so then retroactively it belongs to the buyer, so then yesh kan ribis, so then if the seller is the one consuming the produce, that is going to be a problem of ribis, and that's essentially therefore tzad echad b'ribis. It's only under one scenario where it comes to ribis. Rabbi Yehuda says that's not ribis. Hilkach delok Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, you see that is not going to be following Rabbi Yehuda. And Rashi notes aval seifa, but the end cases, katani mocher mutter v'lokeach chaser. For example, you have the case where the seller is allowed to consume the produce, the lokeach is not, or you have the case of lokeach mutter mocher aser. You have the case where the lokeach is allowed to consume the produce and the mocher is not. So that afilu Rabbi Yehuda moda. Those cases, even Rabbi Yehuda would admit that you have a situation of ribis, again, either by the mocher or by the lokeach, the hasam vada iko ribis, because there it's a case where it is certainly ribis. It's not tzad echad b'ribis. For example, let's say the seller says to the buyer, l'chi maisis kani, that when you bring the money, then you are going to be the owner. So ein lo achshav baklum. So in that situation, right now, the lokeach has no ownership whatsoever. He's not the owner at all. If he's going to be taking produce, that's going to be a problem of ribis. V'afilu gamar, even if he finishes the purchase, he's not the owner till he finishes the purchase. Hilkach peri dehashta ribis ein etzlo. Therefore, the produce right now is considered interest to him. And let's say the other case, where he says that you are the owner right now, meaning the buyer is the owner right now, and the money that he owes is like a loan, he owes it as a debt, so then he is the owner right now. And if the mocher is going to be the one to consume the peiros, then it is going to be ribis. So in those cases, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. This is a brisa, mashchan lo bayis, mashchan lo sada. Let's say he pledges as collateral. Let's say the borrower pledges his house or he pledges his field as collateral to the lender. V'yamar lo, and then the lender says to the borrower, l'cheshetir tzelamochrim, if you ever want to sell these properties, if you ever want to sell this house or if you ever want to sell this field, lo simkrim eloli, he says, I want you to sell it only to me, b'damim halolu aser. Now, if he says, I want you to sell to me at this price, meaning a reduced price, so that's aser. That's going to be a problem of ribbis, because what he's essentially saying is, he's saying, because of the loan that I'm extending you, I want you to extend to me a reduced price on this property. That would be interest. However, if he says b'shaviyein, let's say he says that if you plan on selling this property, I want you to sell it to me at what it's actually worth, so that's mutter. That's going to be okay, because he's not getting any extra deal because of the loan. The Gemara says, Man tana b'damim halalu aser. Now, who's the Tana that says that if he is getting a deal on the property, that would be forbidden? Amar Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says, again, the lo Rav Yehuda does not follow Rav Yehuda. The Rav Yehuda, because if it followed Rav Yehuda, ha'amar tzad echad b'ribis mutter. He says that if it's only going to come to ribis in one scenario, that's mutter. In this case as well, you don't know that he's going to get that reduced price, that this property is going to be put up for sale. It's just a possibility. Therefore, Rav Yehuda would not consider that to be ribis. And Rashi says, Mashchan lo bayis brisi, again, this is a brisa, b'damim halolu, pasuk lo damim muatim, lahosif lo almos alva, latzmisa lo in balamochri, essentially says, there's going to be a little extra money that I'm going to give in addition to the loan, and because of that, you're going to sell it to me, so there already he's getting a reduced rate, so that's again, sad echad, that's a situation where it's only going to come to ribis in one scenario. Hainami, dilma lo asile de ribis, maybe it's not going to be ribis, delo yirtza lamochra liola, maybe the person will never want to sell the property. Well, Rabbi Yehuda, im yirtza lamochra, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if he does decide to sell it, mutter lazel lakavla b'damim shapasak, the person will be allowed to get the property according to the amount of money he set to mitchilas hatanai tzad echad hu have a ribis, because this original condition was just tzad echad, it was just one possibility it would be ribis. Rabbi Yehuda would say that is mutter. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, machar lo bayis, machar lo sada. If a person sells a house or a field to a buyer, v'yamar lo, he says to the buyer, l'chesheyu limos, when I have money, hachzirem li, so then I want you to return the property to me. Essentially, I'm going to redeem the property back, take the property back. So that's also, that's going to be forbidden. L'chesheyu l'chamos achzirem lach. But however, let's say the buyer says to the seller that when you get money, then I'll return it to you. So then mutter, that is going to be mutter. And Rashi explains, Machar lo bayis v'nasan lo kaldam, if he sells him a house and the buyer gives the seller all of the money for the house, v'yamar lo mocher, and then the seller says to the buyer, Amenaskein ani mocher lach, I'm selling it to you on the following condition, shekeshayu limos, that when I do have money, hachzirem li, so then you should return the house to me, v'tol mosech, and take your money, so that's also, that's forbidden. Why? The nimtza she'ein zamecher, because it turns out this is not really a sale over here. Really what's happening is the buyer is really just lending the seller money, and so now the buyer is getting all the produce in the meantime. When the buyer buys this house, essentially, he's going to be taking all the produce. He lent money to the seller. The seller is going to give the money back. The house is going to go back. And what's basically going to happen is that the produce is essentially interest for the loan. Now, however, if the buyer is the one that says that when you get money, then I'll return it to you, meaning the buyer just says this on his own, so then mutter, that's going to be mutter l'kamei mefaresh taima. The Gemara is going to explain further on the reason why that case is different. And the Gemara says, Man Tana, who is the Tana that says in the first case that it's a problem of ribis in this situation? Amar Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says, the lo Rav Yehuda. Again, it's not like Rav Yehuda. The Rav Yehuda ha'amar tzad echad b'ribis mutter, because if we were following Rav Yehuda, again, this is a scenario of tzad echad b'ribis. It's only going to be ribis if it should happen that the person who sold the house ends up getting money and redeems the house. Then you have a problem of ribis. That's tzad echad b'ribis. That's only if one scenario unfolds, it's ribis. And again, Rabbi Yehuda would say it's mutter. Here, of course, we're saying that it's aser. And so the Gemara now asks, Ma'ishna reishu, Ma'ishna seifa. Well, what's the difference between the first case and the second case? In both cases, it seems to be the same basic idea. The idea seems to be that if the seller gets money and wants to redeem back his house, he redeems back the house, and then the buyer gets the produce. Essentially, that produce is interest. So why is it that in the seifa it's okay? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rava says, Seifa d'amar le midaiti. In the Seifa, it's not an obligation. He's essentially saying, he's willingly saying that he's going to return it. It's not something that he has to do. It's not part of the arrangement, and therefore it's not going to be ribis. And Rashi explains, Man Tana I Isserkai, when we're asking who's the Tana, we're saying, who's the Tana that says this is problematic, and we're saying it's not like Rabbi Yehuda, because he says Tzad Echad B'Ribis is mutter. And Hachi Garsinan Da'amar Le Midaito, in the Seifa, the case is that he says it essentially willingly, meaning Im Erza Achzire, meaning to say, the buyer says to the seller, if you get money and I want to, so then I'll return it to you. But you're not able to take me to court over this. If you get money and then I decide, look, I want to really keep the property, I'm allowed to decide that you can't claim it, I can willingly, I'll give it to you. Hilkach mutter, so therefore it's mutter, because even if he goes ahead, meaning the buyer goes ahead and takes back the money and goes back on the sale, but really it was his until this point in time, he's willingly returning it, essentially, he's essentially just selling it back to the seller in such a situation. But in the Reisha, in the first case where he must return it, if the seller is essentially redeeming the property, so meikar lav mecher, so from the very outset, it's not really a sale, and that's why it's problematic. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Hahu gavra dezavan le'ar lechavri. There was a person who sold land to his friend, shelo b'achrayis, but he took no responsibility. Essentially, he said to the buyer, if this land gets taken away from you for whatever reason, there's any claims, I'm not taking any responsibility. You're not going to get your money back. So Chazia Davakotzev, he saw that the buyer was sad because the buyer had made this deal, and essentially he had no protection. So Amar Le, so he said to him, the seller said to the buyer, Amayat Sift, what are you sad about? Itarfu laminach, if people do take it from you, magvino loch shufra shivchu piri. I'm going to make sure to refund you essentially any of the improvements, any of the produce. I'll make sure to make you whole in this situation if the property is taken away. Amar Ameimar says, and Rashi explains, Shelo ba'achrayis, again, the sale was without the seller taking any responsibility. Shemitrafena bal chov sheli, the seller said to the buyer, let's say one of my creditors comes along and takes the property, lo achzer loch klum, I'm not going to return anything to you. Uchagon deparish lehachi behedya. Now he has to actually state that explicitly in the shtar, that he's taking no responsibility. Bishtar, that has to be written in the shtar that he's not responsible. The imistama, because if nothing is written in the shtar, hamukmina kashmuel da'amar achrayis to sofer, we follow Shmuel, who says that we assume if achrayis was left out, it's a mistake by the scribe, and generally the person does take achrayas, the seller does take achrayas, even if it's not written into the shtar. So for the seller to not take achrayas, you have to actually write into the shtar that he's not taking achrayas. In any case, again, in this case, the buyer was sad, and so the seller said to the buyer, Magvina shufra shivchu piri, I'm going to make sure to pay you back with the best property, including the improvements and the produce, meaning may idyas sheben chasei, from the best of my property, efrelach, I'm going to pay you, afes hashevech shetashbiach, even any improvements you made, v'haperos, and the produce, sheyitzrufu mimach, which were taken from you, I'm even going to pay you back that. And the Gemara will continue with Ameimar's statement. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Vav Amud Aleph.